Well, in terms of likely numbers, they're definitely going to go beyond what was agreed in Kyoto, and of course that was not delivered. And it's important to make that distinction between agreement and delivery. But the numbers will be, in my estimation, deeper cuts than were agreed in Kyoto, but not as deep as was estimated by the science as being needed by 2020. The question is then, what will be the trajectory after 2020? And that is something that really needs to be discussed already now, if not explicitly, then implicitly, in terms of allowing those cuts to deeper cuts to come as soon as possible. And so that is important. I think the other set of numbers that one needs to look at as well is financial flows, and because it's not just the emission reductions, and so that is something that I think is going to be quite important to have some sense of, both in terms of what is directly on the table in Copenhagen, like you mentioned, but not, but just as importantly, what are the likely financial flows immediately after Copenhagen through the mechanisms established.
And if I can pick up that point and put it to you, Jose, I remember in Poznan, in the closing hours, some bitterness on the part of some developing countries about the lack of progress on financing, and that the numbers involved just weren't remotely matching expectations or what experts were saying was required. I mean, from where you sit, given that we're in a recession, this country has its own problems, like so many others with the banking crisis. What do you see as achievable at Copenhagen in terms of finance?
Well, yes, Poznan and the last night situation, I think the discussion on mobilizing financial means is a question that maybe should not be too strictly linked to mobilizing cash. And under these circumstances, you know, the parliaments are very cautious about mobilizing, financial amounts. Maybe the question is, how can we, Halldor has mentioned some sums for the adaptation. How can we think, not forcefully having money upfront, but having nevertheless climate action? You know, the financial crisis has shown that the governments have to take some central part in the action of the society. Now, this action of the governments has been, on one hand, of course, providing cash, and Switzerland has done so, like other countries, for some institutions, but also in regulating properly processes and so on, and giving signals, putting frameworks in place, showing directions, indicating goals, targets, providing visions. And it's important in this context. I think that we all recognize that there are a range of needs that go from very immediate needs that have to do with relief after catastrophes coming from weather or climate variability or climate change, however we can qualify them and attribute them, going from these very immediate needs to more structural, medium, long-term needs. And I think that we have to consider what kind of actions, what kind of incentives, what kind of framework will provide in a sustained way really paradigm changes. We are talking about decarbonizing the society. We all have in mind, using the car, but we have also to think of our agricultures. Our agricultures, I use that in plural, in various countries, are also very heavily drawing upon the input from fossil fuels and so on, for fertilizers and so on. So my point is that It's not because we have a financial crisis that there is no money to be mobilized in cash, point number one. But I don't think that this is the solution, because cash is not going to address the long-term structural needs for change that we envisage for decarbonizing the society, and that it's better to think in a holistic way what we can do for immediate needs, yes, some certainly with cash, what we can do for the future in terms of investment, on capacity building, on structural changes, and so on, and maybe not focus attention too much on these discussion on financial immediate needs that are certainly important in some cases, but are not going to be fulfilled under these circumstances, but even in better financial circumstances. So my point is, let's look at what is needed in terms of structural changes. What can be irreversibly done in order to decarbonize our societies, in order to rationalize the use of resources, in order to improve processes, consumption cycles, and so on, and empower all people, including ourselves and so on, for going that way.
Price on carbon, that's what you're talking about?
Switzerland is proposing some approaches that have deep roots in our constitution. You know, for example, polluter pays principle is one of the instruments that you may use for dealing with the use of resources and in trying to internalize these externalities linked to the use of... yes, we think, for example, that if we were to levy $1 per ton CO2 equivalent emitted in the world, we would have something like 50 billions per year. So we could certainly have, with a good redistribution and equitable system, bringing cash in that case to developing countries, we could certainly face adaptation costs and even mitigation and technology transfer and so on. But there we go to the root and we say, well, polluter pays principle. What we intend to do is to get rid of the source and the cause of the problem, not to solve some conjunctural situations that don't help in any case.
José, thank you. And Paul, you've been itching to get in here.
There's an enormous amount to respond to there. One part of it was, if I were a developing country, I would hear what Mr. Romero just said as, don't wait for money. But I want to be clear that the implications of the polluter pays principle are international liability. And one of the things that the rich countries have been very much trying to do is to make it clear that whatever their obligations are for adaptation, they're not legal obligations to provide redress to people who are harmed by previous pollution. Actually embedding the polluter pays principle in international law would be an enormous step with financial liabilities of unbounded size. And that's really, it's being kept off the table because of that. And all the discussion about, well, how are we going to get adaptation funding out of taxes on airplane travel and all this kind of stuff, it's all ways to avoid actually putting international legal liability onto the table. And we're not going to be able to avoid that indefinitely when the scale of damages mounts.
Thank you.